So we've talked a little bit about some of the circumstances around this album, but I do think the context around how this record was made, the way it was released, how much the band changed afterwards is almost as much a part of the story as the music itself. And, there's a lot of different aspects of the record that we'll dive into. But first, let's just talk about Wilco as a band, because sometimes I think of them as a household name at this point. They have won a Grammy, they've been around for 20, 30 years at this point, but I'm still not sure like the average person on the street knows who they are. Right,
For the
Adam?
average person on this call, again,
Well, come on, but Adam, you must have heard of this band, though, right?
not until we had that. Uh, Again, the not Mermaid. Was it Mermaid?
It was Mermaid Avenue.
Yeah,
Yeah.
100
Mermaid Avenue.
episodes ago or something like that. I never,
I feel
Never
like they're
crossed my-
everywhere. Yeah, they were on Parks and Rec, for Christ's sake.
never watched it. Watched a couple episodes.
What is your problem, Adam?
Let's get
I
to the real issues
represent
here.
the everyman
What
for
is
this
your
episode.
deal? Yeah, no,
Well,
you don't.
no,
No, you don't.
Adam's actually proving my less than scientific, claim here, which is that they're not a household name. I think if you know them, you know them, but clearly they're not that known. But Adam is right. Longtime listeners will know we did actually cover Wilco on the show before, going back to episode 62 with the
Damn.
Billy Bragg Mermaid Avenue collaboration, where they took a bunch of old Woody Guthrie poems and turned them into songs. But we didn't get much into the band at that time. If I'm not mistaken, that did not make the list, despite my best efforts to
I don't think
it
that
does
was
belong.
their best effort. Certainly, yeah. I might have
Well-
voted against it. I can't really remember what I said on that call, Alan, but I'm gonna guess I voted against it.
Well, episode 62 feels like a century ago
It was a while.
in podcast time. But so Yankee Hotel Foxtrot was Wilco's fourth studio album, and the personnel on that record consisted of Jeff Tweedy, guitar, lead vocals, primary songwriter. Like, he's the guy. It's his band. And that dynamic was majorly tested throughout the making of this record, most specifically as it relates to the next member of the band, who I name dropped earlier. And that's a guy named Jay Bennett, who I would describe as kind of like the ultimate X factor, especially on this record. He's multi-instrumentalist, played guitars, keys, synth. He was also heavily involved, at least early on, with mixing the record. And that part, which we'll get into shortly, was a big catalyst for him actually being fired from the band as soon as they finished recording this record. Then you had John Stearett on bass, who, aside from Jeff Tweedy, has been the only constant member of the band up until this point. So you guys shit on bassists all you want, but we're the ones providing stability in a world of psychotic guitar players out there.
Like,
That's
I
totally
got no
true.
opinions, boss. Just tell me what to play.
Tell me what root notes we got. Oh, he sings harmony too. He can give some heft to Tweedy's vulnerable vocals.
I actually think the bass gets it on this record, and in Wilco, I've heard a bunch of Wilco records since this record as well, and yeah, I think they're a tight band.
Totally. Then, sort of rounding out the roster for this record, you've got Leroy Bach. So, great name for a musician, by the way.
Oh, hell
He's playing keys and a few other things. And then finally, you have Glenn Cochi on drums, who was actually brought in after they fired their previous drummer early on in the recording sessions. So you're already seeing a little bit of some of the dysfunction of the band, or at least the moving parts. Now, back to Wilco themselves, they don't have any hits with a capital H, but they are considered, again, one of the kind of preeminent indie rock bands of our era, and a group that, although they outright reject this categorization, or at least Jeff Tweedy certainly does, are viewed as the pioneers of what came to be called alt country. And it's exactly what it sounds. It's a blending of alternative rock, hard rock, mixed with country, folk, Americana, that sort of thing. And I think the reason they reject that label so much is because that term really traces back to Tweedy's pre-Wilco days in a band called Uncle Tupelo. Now, won't spend a ton of time on them, but I think it's important to kind of tee up what they did and how they morphed into Wilco ultimately. But Uncle Tupelo was a band that Jeff Tweedy formed in 1987 in his hometown of Belleville, Illinois, with a high school friend named Jay Farrar. Now, a little bit about Jeff Tweedy, because again, we didn't cover him extensively in the last episode, and a little bit about the town he grew up in, because I think it helps a lot of his whole way of being make some sense. As I mentioned, he grew up in Belleville, Illinois, which is basically a suburb of St. Louis. Not totally rural, but he describes it as a fairly depressed town, kind of isolated, lots of alcoholism in the town. It paints a portrait that I feel like I can kind of relate to, having grown up, like most of us on this call, in Wilmington, Delaware. To give you just an idea of this town that he grew up in, though, Jeff Tweedy, in his memoir, which I had a chance to go through over the last couple of weeks, he talks about, I should actually say that I got to go through over the last week.
Oh yeah, be consistent that we all read an entire book in a week.
It's okay.
Yeah. I actually did own the book already, so I guess
All right.
I get a pass on that. But to give you an idea of this town that he grew up in, he talks about working at this liquor store in high school. And before he was even drinking age, he became a manager at this liquor store, and he had to make the nightly cash deposits to the bank every night. So the owner of the store would send him with a loaded gun that he never trained him how to use or how to even take it out of its holster.
Jeez.
The good old days.
Seriously.
That's got country music written all over it,
Yeah.
man.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. And Dad worked for the railroad, as did one of his older brothers, who, in a completely unrelated story, his older brother who worked at the railroad had an incident where he was accidentally buried in gravel and got a sizable settlement from the railroad company. And that settlement is actually what basically funded Jeff Tweedy's first decent guitar, which is the venerable Fender Telecaster.
Wow.
Nice.
His other brother was
So I guess he got unburied in the gravel also, or no, or that was the end of him.
Surprise.
he
Oh,
made it
he
out.
died, but Jeff
It was a
Tweedy got a
wrongful
guitar.
death, right?
So it's all good. But Wilco was formed, so the
Right.
brother's sacrifice was worth it.
It all worked out.
And he pawned that guitar later for like $20. No, I think he still has it. But anyway, so it kind of gives you an idea. But he had another brother who did make it out of the town and went to college and kind of became this hipster audiophile who ended up giving his entire record collection to Jeff, and that's what spurred his love of music, especially a love of punk music and things that were kind of coming out at that time that were not very mainstream or well known. He dabbled with guitar a bit at a young age, but he describes always having a series of shitty guitars that were unplayable, that probably needed fret work. So he just put it back in his closet until I think this was in high school, he had like a really bad bicycling accident. And he had to basically spend the entire summer in his bedroom by himself, nursing his wounds from this accident. And when I first read it, I was like, we've all been in a bike accident. Come on. But he describes it. It was like pretty gruesome. And
Really
so I
jacked
think
up.
that also maybe impacted his, kind of mood and his worldview. But that's when he basically decided to throw himself into guitar and learn how to play music, basically.
Nice. Well, kind of.
Well, I
was
think
thinking like we're over the era of where somebody gets a record collection and then discovers their love of music. Like an event like that triggered something in his head where now like our kids just have every song ever written on a device. You know what I mean? Like there's no like
Yeah.
trigger or
Yeah.
influence from, obviously we play music around our kids that we like, but that doesn't exist anymore. Here's 500 records from my father. And then you go through all of them and it's this experience. Now, I don't know. Sorry,
I don't think
Old
anything can
curmudgeonly Adams
replace
coming out.
the older sibling, the cool older sibling recommendation engine. Spotify's
Okay,
never
okay.
gonna get that right. And especially, I'm assuming part of what Alan's talking about is that era of DIY, early indie, right? That we've referenced many times in the show throughout the 80s, kind of leading up to Nirvana breaking, but the Mudhoneys and Black Flags of the world and the zine culture is stuff that was not that easy to find unless you were an outsider.
Right.
totally. And he also talks about going to he was very close with his mom. He almost describes it as a bit of a codependency, maybe an unhealthy type of relationship, but she would go grocery shopping and he would just spend the entire time reading, the music magazines on the shelf and just starting to figure out who these bands were. And, so he starts playing guitar and he pretty much decided right away that he was not in the camp of I'm going to learn a bunch of theory, scales, and modes. He wanted to just write songs, and that actually became his reputation early on. So much so that he talks about a time when he overheard Jay Farrar telling somebody else at a show, like, "Oh, Jeff, he knows how to write songs." And that was like the most compliment he ever got from Jay Farrar, he says. But that sort of spoke to in some ways, Rob, I think he reminded me of like your approach to songwriting, where it was almost like a compulsion, where I'm going to work and work, and I just have to create until I can't take it anymore, basically. And he always took that very workman-like approach. Writes a song a day, still does. He actually wrote a book about his process of songwriting.
Well,
So
that's amazing, and of course that's very high praise. Thank you. I'm sure I don't deserve it, but I'll just say that one of the things that influenced me is I read a Bruce Springsteen quote when I was really young, and he just said, "I picked up that guitar. I knew I was never going to be the greatest guitar player in the world. I figured I had to pair it with songwriting and singing to make a mark." And that was kind of my thinking too, and maybe that was Jeff Tweedy's thinking as well.
totally.
And you can tell Jeff Tweedy's a guy that loves music and he loves songs and he loves the composition. He has another great book called World Within a Song, where he literally goes through like 50 songs that shaped who he is. And they're very different. And he tells stories about them all. So I love that about him too, that you can tell he's incorporating everything that he's taken in over all these years and kind of put it into his music. He put a whole lot of it into this particular album. Some worked, some didn't, in my opinion. But you can tell that he loves music. He loves songs. He loves writing. He loves the composition. He loves arranging. Like that comes through loud and clear to me anytime Jeff Tweedy's involved in anything, whether it's Wilco or his side projects. You can tell he's a music lover at like deep in his heart. He was a fan first, right?
Mm. Well, I'm actually curious when we get to how this album was made, Alan, because I don't feel like the documentary was that clear on it in terms of the other Wilco records I've heard. They seem more like they're just based on Jeff Tweedy's songs. And so I'm wondering where he fits in to the production here. It seemed like maybe he took kind of a back seat production wise. And I wonder how that then affected some of the songwriting choices. Do you know what I mean? Like, was he incentivized to get stranger and weirder and take bigger swings lyrically because they were making this like soundscape thing? But we'll get to it, I imagine.
Yeah, we'll get to some of that. I think the short answer to that is Jay Bennett was a big catalyst and almost like a monkey wrench in a weird way to what they were doing. Also, I think some of the climate with the recording industry at the time that was mentioned earlier had a lot was pushing them and away in different directions. So yeah, we'll definitely get into some of that momentarily. Back to Jeff Tweedy and sort of his journey, and I won't spend too much more time on this, but ultimately he meets Jay Farrar in high school, realizes that they're both really into punk rock groups like the Ramones, Sex Pistols, Minutemen, who we've covered on the show before. But this kind of music wasn't at all popular in this area. So again, this is, suburban St. Louis in the late 80s. So it was all country music all the time. So they ultimately start an iteration of the band that would become eventually Uncle Tupelo. And the sound that he came up with was this unusual hybrid of high energy rock mixed with Americana. It's a pretty new sound that eventually took on that descriptor of all country.
Kind of sounds like what the Birds did, but okay.
Well, look, it's in cycles, Rob. You have
Oh,
to
got
correct
it.
it
Yeah.
at the times. We forget everything that happened,
It's
10
just
years
hard.
ago.
I mean, maybe I'm out of place, but it's hard to imagine that was really innovative, but it's possible. Or just a reaction to what was popular at the time, perhaps.
Where I think you see it show up most is in looking at some of the live shows that they did. It was pretty high energy. It was almost, it wasn't punk-esque, but they were trying to go for the energy of a punk show, but with the country kind of
Talent.
twang.
Yeah.
And I do think that was something that was a little different. And you're also layering in like the alternative that was starting to happen in like the late 80s, early 90s. So it's a bit different, but I catch what you're saying. Um, so they never made it big, especially on a commercial level, but they were well known and were credited for having, pioneered this genre. But right as they were about to, really take that next leap, Jay Farrar basically quit the band out of nowhere. And, the reason he gave was that he couldn't work with Jeff Tweedy anymore. In his book, Tweedy talks about some one-off incidents. There was a time when he was drunk and Jay thought he was like making moves on his girlfriend or something that he brought up a few years later. But I think ultimately it was just creative and personal differences. And so their paths really diverged at that point, with Jay going on to form a band that Jen referenced earlier called Sunvolt. Jeff Tweedy and the rest of the band just carried on, but under the name Wilco.
You said they never made it big, which is true, but I mean, they had a record contract. They put out a few albums, right?
Oh yeah, they put out 4 albums. They were on the precipice, so I think they probably the high water mark. And I laugh, but I think I would love to do this clearly. But for them, they did get a chance to play on the Conan O'Brien show back in the early days of like 1994, I think. Jay had already actually quit the band by that point, but they kept touring so they could, pay back someone who had invested in the band. So they were like knocking on the door. They
Right.
had a cult following, but they just hadn't really had that
I just
massive
always want to
break yet.
I want to put musical success in context sometimes, because that's so much farther than any of us could have dreamed of
Yes.
getting.
Correct.
Without question, but compared to what has happened with Wilco, who's had
Sure.
this decades-long career, it maybe pales in comparison to what
Yeah.
they've done.
They even appeared on a hit sitcom that Adam didn't watch.
Imagine
I didn't
that.
watch the show either, so I'll throw myself in with you, Adam. And so it, not that these guys were in competition, but there was an aspect of like the indie music media such that it was at the time that was kind of trying to pit these guys against each other. And I do think it was tough for Jeff Tweedy at first, because the first Sunvolt album actually did much better commercially and critically than Wilco's first release, which was called AM. And AM was very much a continuation of Uncle Tupelo, definite country vibes mixed with alternative rock. I would argue is probably not the best representation of what they came to sound like, but I have come to appreciate that record a lot more over the years. So they released AM. After that, they released their follow-up, which is really when they started to break away from the all country thing and radically changed their DNA when they hired Jay Bennett. So a second Jay to confuse things. And he helped them write and record a double LP called Being There, which is also on Dimery's list, which was a little bit of a surprise to me, to be honest. I think it's cool, but a little surprised to see that one on the list.
I think by comparison to this record, it does sound a little more straight ahead, but made a splash probably in the indie world at the time.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. So Jay Bennett claims that he was really brought in to play guitar, but he had this like mad scientist, multi-instrumentalist kind of thing going on that added a totally different element to what they were doing. And so he just over time ends up getting more and more involved. He ends up doing a lot of their mixing, playing all kinds of instruments. And I think that starts to account for like the wild shit you hear on this record. They ended up releasing a third album called Summer Teeth, and this is though where his imprint, Jay Bennett's imprint, is on things, but his involvement starts to become more problematic with the band, where he's becoming tough to work with. He started getting really hell-bent on using instruments on songs, even if they weren't, the right choice for the songs. He's also clearly becoming addicted to opiates at that time, as was Jeff Tweedy. So there were tons of pills around the studio all the time. And the record label, which at the time was Reprise Records, they were still really into Wilco, but by this point, the albums were not selling as much as they wanted to, even though Wilco was starting to sell out theaters and becoming critical darlings, but it didn't seem like there was an obvious path to becoming commercially viable for the label. Which brings us to Yankee Hotel Foxtrot. So a big part of the story with the record is the manner that it was actually released. So technically it was self-released by the band on their website on what was supposed to be 9/11, so September 11th, 2001.
Oh,
And then a day or two before that, they decided to push it back a week for some technical reasons, obviously unrelated to what would happen on September 11th. But
They
there's always
notice that they still have a song on there called "Ashes of American Flags." Like it feels
Oh,
weirdly
jeez.
prescient,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
There's a few
I
spots
didn't
on there that
recognize.
feel there's a tall building shake,
Yeah.
lion on there. It must have felt real surreal when it came out.
Wow.
Or sorry, maybe to them when 9/11 happened.
Yeah. War
well,
on war. I mean, all of it.
totally. And that actually, there's been a kind of a red herring about this record that people assume that there is a connection because yeah, the album cover, there's two towers with a beige background. It's not the Twin Towers, it's actually the Marina
Oh,
City
shit.
Complex in
Dude,
Chicago.
this is crazy. You're putting this all together, man. Wait, produced by Taliban. There it is. I didn't notice that. Damn it.
Yeah. So there's all these different coincidences and they're just that. It's a coincidence, but I will say there's like a melancholy aspect to this album that I do think intentionally or not. I mean, obviously it wasn't intentional, but it does fit the vibe of the country at the time, I think.
Yeah, I think. Well, they were probably responding to the George Bush era and the Supreme Court deciding for George Bush, which a lot of people felt like that was a stolen election from Al Gore. And, that was definitely the vibe even leading into September 11th.
Fair, fair. Now, back to this being self-released by the band, which is an important part of this story. It was actually picked up and then given a proper studio release by None Such Records 7 months later on April 23rd, 2002, which might not seem like an odd thing today with how much people self-publish, put their own stuff out. But back then, these record companies were basically lumbering dinosaurs that were just getting hit with a digital asteroid in the form of internet streaming. This was when Metallica was going to war with Napster and things were starting to
Yeah,
sort
right.
out
Oh, yeah.
legally.
That was so ahead of its time. So insanely ahead of its I just looked up for context. I remember that when Radiohead released In Rainbows in 2007, they released it as a pay what you will model on their website. And that was revolutionary.
Man.
And this is
Yeah.
way before that.
Yeah. Well, as you'll learn, their hand was a little bit forced. So even Jeff Tweedy will say, everyone says like, "Oh, what a stroke of brilliance," but really they didn't have a lot of options at the time, as you'll see momentarily. But so this was really like the Wild West for music distribution at that time. And on that note, I asked ChatGPT to hypothesize what would have been the most illegally downloaded songs back in 2001. I want to see if you all can guess which ones made that list. I've got a list of 4 songs and curious, Adam, I think one of them will get you excited, but
Is it a
curious
Creed
what
song?
close.
Hoobastank's the reason.
No.
2001, like a Jack Johnson song. Oh no.
No, think much more radio obvious, not obvious, but
Michelle Branch.
big.
No, I don't know. I need some.
Rob, any guesses?
No, sorry.
Okay. Well, here's what they are, just for to give you a little sense. This is very unscientific. In the End by Linkin Park. Rollin' by Limp Bizkit. Adam, that's what made me
Oh,
think of you.
my God.
I hate Limp Bizkit.
Wow.
The
Adam, you
real
should take that. Adam should take that as a serious insult.
That is an insult.
You need to
Only
throw your
like-
glove down and demand
I
satisfaction
like
after that.
System of a Down.
You can
Not
challenge me to a duel. No, I say that because I feel like I have heard you constantly doing the rolling.
Oh yeah.
Not suggesting you
Hands up
actually
now,
like
hands
this.
down. What you gonna do next? Yes, that is my Fred Durst impression that occasionally creeps up. So
That's actually the whole reason I came today, was I was
for that,
hoping
all right.
for a Fred Durst impression. Yeah, that's what I needed. All right, bye guys. No.
Well, it only took us an hour to get there. Our work here is done. Thank you. The other 2 options being The Real Slim Shady by Eminem and then Independent Woman Part 1 by Destiny's Child, which I don't know that I could sing a lick of, but apparently people were streaming it, or at least ChatGPT thinks they were.
It was in the Charlie's Angels movie, just to help get everyone on the
okay.
same page.
Thank you. Appreciate that. It's good context. See?
See, it's why you need the lady
Diversifying.
energy. Here we go. Here we go.
Awesome. So at this time, the record companies were getting really skittish about what they would put out. They were getting a lot more sort of risk averse, and that was especially true for Reprise Records, which was set to release this record. And again, they were viewed as an up and coming band, but they weren't seen as being a guaranteed, commercial type of thing. And they still didn't have the cachet to really force feed such an experimental record. And what happened was they end up recording this. They submitted it to Reprise in June of 2001, and the label rejected it almost immediately. And basically said, we can't put this out. It's not going to make any money. You had the cliche, we don't hear a single, but it was also so experimental and different from what they had done before that they just looked at it as an obvious loss.
Well, let's talk about the lumbering dinosaur thing just for a second, because I think what may be easy to miss is the idea that, yeah, they paid them to make it in the studio, right? But then if they're going to release it, it's not just about, it's partially the cost of printing the records, but they got to distribute it, they got to market it. The cost has to be like 10x from there if they're ever hoping to recoup or make it a hit, right? And so that is a big and valid, frankly, business milestone for a company to jump off at.
Totally. And the backdrop of all this too was that there was a lot of upheaval with Reprise at the time, and there was all these mergers happening. And so not only did they refuse to release this, but they ended up actually dropping Wilco from the label entirely because they refused to change any of it. And what was one of a series of moves that ended up being like a total self-boosh on the part of Reprise was that they gave away the rights of this album to Wilco and then ostensibly bought them back under a different subsidiary like 6 months later.
Well, so is it true? I heard a rumor that they heard the album. They said, we're not releasing it, like no question. And it sounded like from the documentary that there wasn't even a real discussion about here's what you should change. Wilco, not that they would have been open to that, but it's not like the record label was even engaging in those kinds of discussions. But then they kind of heard, like, why did they give the record back is what I'm trying to get at. I thought it was they heard there was some groundswell of like, do not do this. They're a much beloved, the fans are super loyal and they have a lot of friends in show business and things like that.
Yeah, good question. So what I came across, the story as it kind of unfolded for me was that again, Reprise was a subsidiary of, and this is going to get into some corporate nonsense here with mergers and acquisitions, but they were a subsidiary of a recently formed merger that was created out of AOL Time Warner. As part of that merger, they laid off hundreds of people, one of whom was the president of Reprise, this guy Howie Klein, who was Wilco's biggest supporter within the franchise, I guess. He almost certainly would have released it as is. But the guy they put in charge after he left was much more of a pop guy, and I think his big success story was pushing Sugar Ray into the mainstream for comparison. So he's the guy actually who allegedly dropped that quote I mentioned in the intro about it possibly being a career killer for the band. So what started to happen was they didn't want anything to do with the record, and Wilco's legal team actually negotiated a $50,000 buyout that the band would pay to Reprise that would give them the full rights to take the album and do whatever they want with it. Gets to your point, Rob. The news started to leak that they were dropping Wilco, and it wasn't that it was a huge groundswell, but they were starting to get some bad press around dropping them, and they actually started getting worried that other bands wouldn't want to work with them anymore. So basically, they just cut their losses and said, "You can have it for free. Take it. You're free agents.
Wow.
Do whatever you want with it."
Oh man,
that is such a windfall.
Yeah,
and very rare at the time. Like it was not happening to a lot of bands at that time. And what started happening was a lot of the singles started leaking online, and so people started showing up to Wilco shows already knowing the words to these songs that hadn't been released yet. So that's when they said, we're just going to release it on our website, and started to get some traction. They end up shopping it around, and it gets picked up by None Such Records, who again is a subsidiary of the same conglomerate.
So to your point though,
probably in the first place,
probably when they released it on their website, did they even have a way of making money off it at that moment? Like, I feel like the infrastructure around paying for music was just way less mature at that time. They certainly weren't getting any streaming money because streams weren't a thing.
No, I think they just put it out as a as an offering.
Just have it, yeah, yeah. That's
And
because that's what I'm saying. I think by the time Radiohead came around, did the In Rainbows thing, that was revolutionary. Partly because what the band was doing, but also because you had a band set up their own payment system where you could enter an amount of money and go through a thing. It's just hard to flash back to a time when technology was this antiquated that they really had no choice but just to give it away.
basically, and I think they were hypothesizing that, well, yeah, they had no choice, but also it started to get them a little bit of buzz. People were talking about them. It probably was leading to more people going to shows and things like that. But ultimately, again, 6 months later, they did sell it to an agency, so they still needed to monetize it in that way. And
Yeah, yeah.
the record has gone on to sell enough copies that made it a pretty dismal business decision for Reprise, which leads us into our favorite segment of this podcast called By the Numbers.
Woo!
So let's start with the number 600,000, which is the number of copies that this album has sold since
Damn.
that formal release.
Damn.
Yeah, I don't know how much labels were making off each album back in the day, but even if it's $5 an album, you're into the like several millions of dollars at this point that they just straight up gave away.
Well, also just take a beat to realize just how wrong they were and how weird a record it is to be selling that much. Whether it's the lyrics or the production, we all agreed it's not for everybody. So it's kind of bizarre that it is a hit.
That I agree with. Yeah. I hate to see artists make bad decisions. We talk about all the time, but I don't really mind when it happens to a record label, let's be
The
honest.
record companies.
Dude, why don't they just, I mean, it feels like the same lesson gets wrought on history again and again. You are the one that chose the artist to do the thing they do, and then even paid for it. And then you just don't want to follow through with that for some reason. When the artist's like, this is what I want to do. You're like, nope, I changed my mind. You don't know what you're talking about anymore.
But isn't that a survivor bias? Like, you don't know how many terrible bands they said no to, that if they had brought them on, they'd be bankrupt.
But
Just
what
a
I'm saying
thought.
is, I think yeah, there is that, but you should. Alan mentioned that there was turnover within the company, right? And that was a part of it. Somebody who was a fan of them agreed, but theoretically, you should trust your original instinct. You made the decision to bring them on and make this record because we believe that what you make will be good because we trust you. You're the creative. You handle creative. And then you're going back on that decision after you're whatever $60,000 in the hole
Yeah,
from
right.
making the record. That's stupid.
Well, unless he did to like walk into the studio and see like opioids everywhere and was like, huh, I wonder what this is going to sound like. And then gives it a listen and is like, oh, it sounds like the whole band's on opioids. Maybe we want to
Yeah.
hold it.
Like
Some
Jay
weird
Bennett.
auto harp or something laying in the corner. Like, what are all these obscure
What's happening?
instruments on the floor?
Is that a glockenspiel I see?
Well, this is actually a perfect segue to my next number on the list, which is the number 20, which is a rough estimate of the number of instruments that Jay Bennett played on this record. Among the more interesting ones were pump organs, which I wasn't even sure what that was, toy pianos, as mentioned earlier, manual tape loop effects, and what Jay described as, quote, artificially generated orchestra sounds. Whatever the hell that
Mm.
means. Um,
The pump-
there
on
was
a
a
side note, good.
no, go for it, Adam. I'm talking too much.
So the pump organ is interesting in areas where, organs weren't yet electrified. You would actually have two pedals, kind of like if you think the old school sewing machine had like a thing that would, you'd use your feet. The pump organ had two bellows essentially that you would pump and essentially run in place and get into a rhythm where you were blowing enough air constantly into the reeds and you would play the organ. Very weird, almost ancient sounding wooden kind of thing.
Well, clearly we need another one of those for
We need more of
our
those.
next recording venture.
More pump organ.
Yeah.
Said,
Bring me
said
my
no one ever.
dulcimer.
So next number is 10, which is the score out of 10 that this record received from Pitchfork at the time, which I can't tell if I like it more or less after hearing that review, but I think in retrospect they were onto something with that.
I think this
review.
is where Jen's initial criticism resonates with me. That this is, in a way, it's the beginning of the 21st century hipster. right? And I don't exactly think that's Wilco's fault, and that vibe has since been co-opted and become the standard for
Right.
lame dudes everywhere who don't go out and cultivate their own identity, but instead just go to Urban Outfitters and buy whatever shirts they have there. So I get it. It fits.
Yes.
For sure. Next number is 5,000, which is the estimated number of cigarettes seemingly smoked throughout this documentary. If you've watched this there's not a scene where someone doesn't have a cigarette hanging out of their mouth. I mean,
Yeah.
Jay's playing keyboards with like a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. It's like, how are you even enjoying that? I just thought that was a really funny part
I
of.
noticed that too. He's constantly has the cigarette hanging out, and I don't know if Jeff Tweedy had some kind of editing rights on the documentary, but Jay Bennett does not come off well in that. He comes off like a dick.
He does. We'll talk a little bit about that momentarily, but yeah, it does not. It beats him up a good bit, and I think it does crush his public image a little bit in a way that I think some deserved, some maybe not, but not a flattering portrait for sure. And then the last number is number 5, which is the number of dollars it costs per month to join our Patreon community at the premium level, which I gotta say, I've been going in there a good bit. The commentary in there is getting pretty good, and I feel like it's giving me a run for my money on this program. So definitely check it out. You'll have access to a lot of our bonus content, things like our song battle series, and my personal favorite, which is our guilty pleasures series, which gives you a chance to boosh us right back for some of our terrible choices in the music we listen to when we think nobody is around.
And thank you, Alan. We have just started releasing our song battle Say My Name edition, which was very contentious, I should tell you. So you're definitely going to want to check that out. The theme was songs with women's names in the title, and we got some pretty outlandish submissions.
Love that. Love that. But look, if you're oversubscribed or afraid to make the commitment, there's definitely a lot you can access at the free level. And of course, in general, leaving a review on the podcast, subscribing, telling a friend, all that stuff really goes a long way to help us grow this thing and amplify our complaints far and wide. So thank you all for that so far. Okay. Getting back to the recording here, as we've alluded to a bunch of times here, the other big aspect of this recording that's played a big part in the lore of the album was Jeff Tweedy's relationship with Jay Bennett. The documentary covers some aspects of it, but it doesn't fully explain why things fell apart with him and the band. They do show an argument between the two of them about the way one of the songs fades into a different song, like where the cut should be made. But honestly, I've fought with everyone on this call except for Jen probably about stuff like that a million times. And
Yeah.
So when you watch it, you don't think you're like, okay, that seems like a pretty normal argument.
Agreed. All very standard band arguments from the documentary's perspective.
For sure. Now, in the book, in Tweedy's memoirs, where he goes a lot more into depth about the relationship, and he talks about really the way Jay was starting to become super shady about his role in the band. So he was really subverting everybody behind their back. It was becoming a situation where if you weren't in the room with him, he was talking shit about you. And if Jeff wasn't there, he was undermining Jeff to the band. If it was Jeff and Jay just sitting there mixing, he would say something like, hey, we don't need the rest of the band. Like, we can record all this ourselves. And it was just this series of behaviors that were unhealthy and toxic to a collaborative partnership. There was one scene that kind of ties some of this all together with all the instruments and Jay Bennett's, kind of weirdness, where for whatever reason, and I can't recall which song this shows up on the album, but Jeff Tweedy describes a scene where him and Jay agreed to basically turn on all these different instruments. They're basically taping together keys on the keyboard so that it would just sort of lay out in a weird way, and that they would leave it all on overnight so that they would come back the next morning to this cacophony of insane sounds.
I like the idea that letting it marinate for 12 hours is going to be somewhat different than 12 seconds of it.
Yeah, that's some real Brian Wilson shit right there.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. That's
Totally.
call the guy with the big net to come put it over your head.
And so as this is already kind of crazy enough, but I think what irked Jeff about this was that the next morning when he came back to the studio, Jay was already there showing the film crew around, being like, "Hey, look at this thing I did. I did this thing last night and look at it." And it was just all these unhealthy, toxic, it's all about me, kind of things. There were some issues with him, thinking that he was going to mix the album, but they didn't like the mixes he was doing. And so Jeff Tweedy secretly brought in Jim O'Rourke, who's another indie rock guy, multi instrumentalist, who's either played with or produced music for bands like Stereolab, Sonic Youth, bunch of other people. So they actually asked him to just mix one of the songs as like a proof of concept, and they all loved it so much that they just had him end up mixing the entire rest of the record. And then the tensions just started to grow, so much that finally Jeff fired Jay from the band as soon as the recording was done. And I will say, like, it's one of those things that sounded like it needed to happen in order for the band to survive. But in my mind, they were never the same after this. I think they still made some good music, and some of the records after this, I would rank among my favorites of theirs. But this was just such a high watermark that it really, I think it took something major away from the band, even if it was what enabled them to survive in the first place.
Well, let me comment on that because I think it's important. One of the reasons I think we respect bands on this show, this is one of our points of agreement, is the idea that you have to keep moving forward. You have to keep evolving. You can't, you could not have repeated themselves. And so let me just say right off the bat, I'm glad they did not even attempt to repeat this success and remake Yankee Hotel Foxtrot or make a sequel to it. That said, I think they're also a band that's interested enough in reinvention. I think the next great Wilco record is the one where they added Nels Cline to the band because he's just like a force of a guitar player, changes the color of the music. Anyway, that's my example of why I do think it's a band that's at least attempting to strive and evolve.
I agree with that. He was definitely not a direct replace. They did do one album in between those called A Ghost is Born, and I think Sky Blue Sky is what you're referring to, Rob, with Nels
Yeah.
Cline.
Sky
And
Blue Sky is great.
he does usher in kind of a new chapter for the band, but I think in totality, their the work never quite lived up to this, but that's common, to have that high watermark for bands, I think.
And I'm okay with that. That's what I'm saying. You can't redo an experimental masterpiece. It's just not going to happen. So why
Good
try?
point. Now, the last thing I'll just say about Jay Bennett and his departure from the band is I did think the documentary did him a little bit dirty with some of the categorizations. Specifically, there's a scene where I think it's the manager or like the lawyer of the band, and he's talking about how Jay wore out his welcome. But then he makes his comment about, now he has to get used to playing in front of 35 people instead of playing in front of sold out stadiums. And it shows him in like some high school gym, playing guitar. And I thought that was a
That's
little
rough.
That's
fucked
mean.
up.
Yeah.
Oh.
Counterpoint, he is a white guy with dreads, though.
Oh, so he may deserve.
That is a good point. I don't know how that didn't come up already. That's already grounds for dismissal. All right. Well, we've done enough talking, I think, about the context. Let's get into some of the songs here.